Right. Welcome to the first of three sessions in which we are talking a little bit about the Siddur. There's a lot to say, more than three sessions worth, no doubt. But I wanted to start today, hi Michelle, by talking actually in quite broad strokes. So what we're going to do is say a little bit about the project that Ruth and I have been working on called Siddur Kolrina, which you have heard a bit about, and show you some of the pages and talk a little bit about why we made the decisions we made and what goes into designing a Siddur. But I want to start actually with the kind of fundamental questions of what a Siddur is, because I think we kind of take that for granted. So, most of us, at some point or another, if you spend any time in a synagogue, will be handed a book called a Siddur and told we're on page whatever. Hopefully, you're told what page you're on. You might not be told what page you're on. You might just wander in and try and figure out by watching everyone else where you are. And what that book might look like could vary considerably, both in size, in length, in color, in heaviness, in all sorts of things. There are so many Siddurim and so much diversity of what they look like, and yet, by and large, they all have exactly the same thing in them. It's quite a strange aspect of Jewish life that we have an infinite appetite for diversity when it comes to making more and more and more and more and more Siddurim, and I have at least 30 I could pull off these shelves and show you. But essentially, what's in them is largely the same. There are variations based on whether you're looking at Sephardi or Ashkenazi ritual, or within those many variations. There are different approaches to translation or not, transliteration or not, commentary or not. There are even some that have prayers in them that are added or removed compared to the standard text. But by and large, and it is a generalization, but I do think it's true, 90% of what you'd find in any one Siddur is going to also be in every other Siddur. So why do we have so many? If that's the case, then why bother making so many Siddurim? As Kohelet's going to tell us in a few weeks, is there no end to making books? When it comes to Siddurim, there's not really. Part of the reason is because I think it's a very emotive object, the Siddur. It's something that you have a very intense relationship. Those who have a prayer life, particularly those who pray every day, which is not all of us, but perhaps at times has been some of us, will have a relationship with the book they use that is quite profound. You see many people who have tattered, absolutely destroyed Siddurim because they've used it every day. They've shoved it in pockets and bags and suitcases. They've carried it in the rain and sunshine. They've lost it. They found it again. You see other people who use absolutely pristine Siddurim that hardly look like the spine's been cracked. Some people use the same Siddur every day and never change. Some people, myself included, because I'm a bit of a maniac, often use a different Siddur every time they pray, which I admit is a bit crazy. You have all sorts of approaches to how one approaches prayer, but you can't really pray. And this is, I think, the strange thing for many. You can't really pray without a Siddur. There was a time when it was probably fairly common for Jews to memorize their prayers. That was possible because the prayers were very brief, they were very short, and there were very few books. So you didn't have much choice but to memorize them. Nowadays, the Siddur has grown, partially on purpose, partially by accident. We can talk more about its own history and development. And we've lost the aptitude for memorization that we once had. It was very common in previous generations, particularly we go back kind of 1,000 years or more, for Jews to memorize the Tanakh, to memorize the Siddur, to have all of these things able to be recalled from memory. This is partially because of practicalities. There weren't printed books, and handwritten ones were expensive and difficult and rare, but also because it was something that was tolerated and encouraged and actually taught. Particularly Jews living in Muslim countries, where there was tradition to memorize the Quran and to be praised for doing so, had a long tradition of memorizing the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or at least the Torah, and certainly the Siddur. But I don't know anyone today who has the entire Siddur memorized. I know a few people who have the Amidah memorized or the Shema memorized and can say most of their prayers from memory. But by and large, again, well over 90% of Jews, when they pray, are praying with a Siddur. So we have most people, by a huge margin, using a Siddur, and we have most of those Siddurim, despite their diversity, being largely the same. Which leads us to the question of if we're going to make a Siddur, how and why do we make a new one? And what should it look like and what should be in it? Before we dive into that, I'm curious whether anyone wants to share experiences, either really positive or really negative, of Siddurim they really love and why, or Siddurim they absolutely hate and are never going to use again, and every time they use it, it makes them infuriated, and why? Anybody have strong feelings about certain Siddurim and can tell us why they have those feelings?
I don't like the Sim Shalom.
Oh, wow, coming right out with it. Don't like the Sim Shalom. Can you tell us why you don't like the Sim Shalom? What is it about Sim Shalom?
Primarily the translations in it, actually. I think if it didn't have any translation in it, I wouldn't notice any issue.
Interesting. So this is something I hear quite often, and maybe people feel similarly. Many people who grew up with a Siddur that was only in Hebrew, when they started using one in English, liked the Siddur less because they actually don't really fancy the translation. They don't really enjoy finding out what it is they're saying. They much rather just say it like it's magic words without understanding it. Some people feel differently and would much prefer to say what they understand and read the English, and that's also perfectly acceptable. There are very few halachot about how one should pray in terms of what the text should be or what language it should be in. You can say your prayers in pretty much any language, and you should understand what that language is. So actually, it does matter what the translation is if you have one, because you should be reading something that you understand as much as possible. It's not magic. Prayer is not magic.
Um, can I just say,
Yeah,
uh, the Lev Shalem, which we use the Mahzor for, and we use the Lev Shalem Siddur for some of our online stuff. It's just too busy for me. And the pages, first of all, the pages are flimsy. I don't like flimsy pages because I'm frightened I'm going to tear them. And then there's all the stuff around the outside, and it's just a huge distraction. And I want to be focusing on what I need to focus on, and
really
not be distracted by flim flam.
flim flam. That
Flim
is
flam.
a word only you would use, I suspect. Flim flam.
Well, I have the same feelings about the reform Siddur as Ruth for similar reasons, really. I mean, the paper is awful
Okay.
and creases and tears but also everything, absolutely everything is transliterated. I just don't think that's necessary. I think maybe the Shema, maybe the Kaddish, but if people are serious, they'll learn to read Hebrew, which isn't that difficult.
Ooh.
I
Oh,
think
fighting words.
I just think it's bending too far,
Okay, fabulous.
and it's really irritating to use.
I think I have actually the Reform one here. I don't have it online, so I can't show it, but I do have Lev Shalem. And Ruth, because you raised it, I'll just share the screen so we can have a look at some of those things you found irritating. All that flim flam. Those who have joined us online might recognize this. This is what a Lev Shalem spread looks like. This is maybe not an indicative one. This is from Havdalah, but it's what I could find. Just to point out, what do we actually notice about how this page is constructed? We're going to talk a lot about how pages are constructed, ignoring the horribly annoying watermark they put on this page, which evidently we could only use this March and April 2020. So sorry, Rabbinical Assembly, but it's a little bit out of date. What do we notice about how the page is constructed here? What's the flim-flam, Ruth, that you mentioned, and where are the things that we're talking about? How are they structured?
So there's commentary down the outside margins, on both sides of the page.
And there are two different styles of commentary, both in terms of
Yeah.
content and design. So if you look at the left-hand margin of the spread, the commentary here are texts, right? They are direct translations of rabbinic texts, which are introduced by a heading, light, and then it gives this passage from the Talmud. Speaking of things that are infuriating, one of the things I find infuriating about this text, about Lev Shalem, excuse me, is that while they give sources, they do not give sources. Anyone who spent time learning in Jewish spaces will know you cannot cite something and then say the Talmud. The only people who do that are people who haven't spent any time with the Talmud. The Talmud has 7,000 pages, I think. You kind of need to say what page you got it from. So if you notice, I'm not sure how big screens you're on, this simply says Talmud of the Land of Israel. Not good enough. How they got away with that is astounding to me without giving a source. Right. Similarly, this passage below, the Hasidic master of Roijen taught. Where is the source? Where is that from? You don't just cite things in Judaism without a source. Or at least that's how I feel. So that often aggravates me. On the other side, the commentary is different. This commentary is line by line. So it highlights a what we call in Hebrew a dibor hamachil, the word that begins it. So there's a word in bold that links to something in the text, and then it offers a little bit of commentary. Often it cites historical features or reference other places or explains this is a reference to Isaiah, this is from Psalms, etc. So they're different commentaries for different purposes, which is already very noticeable, and they take up the outside margins of the page. The inside of the page has the Hebrew on the right-hand side and the English on the left-hand side. Do we like the Hebrew on the right-hand side? What about the Hebrew is attractive or unattractive?
Yeah, I think I think it's quite clear, readable, short lines. And I would also like to say I quite like the flim flam.
Excellent. We got a pro Flim Flam contingent. Pleased to hear it. Flim Flam fan club. Um, how about the English? Notice the English is two things going on. It has English, which is in regular black text, and then it has the transliteration, the one that Elizabeth was talking smack about earlier, which is in smaller red text below. Not everything is transliterated. I don't think. No, on this page, actually, everything is transliterated because the assumption is this is a page where everything is sung aloud. This is songs that are sung at Havdalah. That's where we are right now on this one page. How do we feel about the transliteration being next to the translation in this way? Is it useful? Is it practical? Why? Why not?
I'm going to say just don't talk to me about transliteration. That's it. That's what I'm going to say.
Sorry,
I find it a bit annoying.
Right. It's a little bit annoying. Kind of gets in the way. If you're reading the English, you got to jump with your eyes. Other things I want us to notice, because we're going to look at some comparisons, are the instructions. On this page, there's only one set of instructions, which are in italicized red text, both on the Hebrew and English, where it says greetings are exchanged. That's what I mean by instructions. Also want to highlight the highlights, and that they use headings for the page to say what's on this page. So here it says songs for the week ahead. And also want to highlight what I call the apparatus. So here we're looking at the very bottom of the page, which has the page number on the corner on each side, right and left, and then has where you are on the service, weekday, and over here, Arvit Lechol. So weekday evening service in black, Arvit Lechol in black, and then Havdalah and Havdalah in red. Okay. There's more nuance and more granular level, but I just want us to get a sense of this page because we're going to look at a couple different pages and talk about them. Before we do that, I want to actually walk you through what is usually the starting point for Siddur design in my world. And I'll tell you more about kind of Siddurim that I've made or helped make and what I think is good or bad about them, and you can tell me the same. So first of all, huge credit to my friend and colleague Aharon Varadi. Aharon runs something called the Open Siddur Project. If you don't know about the Open Siddur Project, I highly recommend it. It's a website which is really an archive online of all sorts of materials related to Jewish prayer. Versions of prayers, translations of prayers, prayers that have been written. It's easily accessible, it's searchable, and it's kind of an amazing variety of things that have been kind of combined together. Aharon is an amazing person, lots of reasons. One of them is he's kind of done this in his free time. And one of the things he's done quite a bit is help people design Siddurim. As far as I'm aware, he's only made one of his own, which I'm looking for but can't find, which is a beautiful Siddur for Friday night, which is one of my favorite ones when we're doing this conversation in person to show people because it looks very unusual. And when Aharon works with anyone to help design a Siddur, which he does often, he's kind of known as a Siddur design consultant. These are some of the questions that he encourages people to think through. So I just want to talk through these ourselves before we talk more about Kol Rina and about other Siddurim. So first of all, we start with the content, right? First question on content is translations. Are there translations? That's not a given, right? Many Siddurim are Hebrew only. Even many Siddurim that have English instructions, but Hebrew only text. There's a very well-loved series of Koren Siddurim called the Koren Talpiot Siddurim, which are the traditional Hebrew text, Hebrew only, but the instructions are in English. So if you're the sort of person like perhaps Lee is, who would rather just have the Hebrew in front of you, but still would benefit from English language instructions about what to do and when, then that's the Siddur for you. But if you're going to use translation, then you have to ask yourself, as Aharon encourages us, what style of translation? Is this high formal English? Is this the King James Bible English? Is this modern colloquial English? Are you making the Gen Z Siddur and everything's going to have slang in it? There's lots of ways to choose how to translate, especially with English's variety of words. Other languages might be different in terms of the register or even the dialect, right? If you're translating into, I don't know, Greek, you might have to choose, am I going to use, well, it's not really a choice anymore, but am I going to use Koine Greek? Are we making an ancient Greek Siddur? Are you going to use modern, what is it called? The popular version of Greek that people use. There's lots of languages that have many variations. There's two ways to write Norwegian. Which way are you going to do it, etc. I don't know if anyone's. Yeah, there is a Norwegian Siddur. I've seen it. Anyway, the following questions, assuming we're talking English, is gender, right? Hebrew is a gender language. English is not. That's a common challenge that you face when you translate things from Hebrew to English, is how to refer to things which use often the masculine language and grammar, but are actually intended to be neutral. Or things that use the feminine language or grammar, but are meant to be neutral. How do you identify which are neutral and which are intended to be the gender that's represented by their grammar? How do you translate them? That's one of the biggest and thorniest questions around Siddurim these days because it feels very politically loaded, and one that Ruth and I have dealt with quite a bit on this project as well. Those are only some of the questions around translation. I'd say there's others in terms of how accurate do you want the translation to be versus how readable do you want it to be. There's a slider between, is this right, Ruth? You feel free to chime in and tell me if I'm wrong. There's a slider between literal translation and readable translation, which are often at odds. And trying to find the right spot is not easy. Hyper literal translation of Hebrew is actually really difficult to read in English. A word for word literal translation is not fun. It's not fluid. It doesn't flow. But if you make the translation completely readable and understandable, you go far from the actual intended meaning, perhaps, of the language. Just a couple illustrations for those who don't know it. I don't know a Siddur that's hyper literal, but there's a great translation of the Torah that is hyper literal done by Everett Fox, which is literally word for word into English. It's very awkward to read because it's an exact rendering of the Hebrew into English as close as possible. It doesn't make for easy reading, but it is useful if you're learning and you want to look at the English and you can actually identify each word. On the other end of that spectrum are Siddurim published by the early American Renewal Movement and done by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who believe that if you were davening in English, you should have it be davenable, which I know is not a word, for lots of reasons. And so he would write the translation in his Siddurim in a way in English which is very easy to read, but was actually very far from the literal translation of the Hebrew, trying to capture the interpretive meaning of the Hebrew, and mostly focusing on the functional use of that English as a davening tool. He intended people would read the English not as English, but in the style of leading Hebrew, to daven the English. There's also people who've tried to do something similar with Torah trope. How can you read the English translation in trope? It's a very interesting project. It's a question about what translation's purpose is. Is it there as an aid? Is it there to help you to go, okay, that's what that means? Or is it actually the text itself? How do you look at it? When you look at a Siddur and you look at the translation, is the translation the text of the Siddur? Or is it just there as a translation, a rendering of the text, and actually the Hebrew page is the text? Different people will look at it different ways. Transliteration. There is nothing more controversial than transliteration when it comes to Siddurim. How much, first of all, is there transliteration, excuse me. Is there transliteration, also known as Romanization? Is it there? Is it a lot of it? Is it a little bit? Is it in a different color? Is it on the same page? Is it very triggering to Ruth, as in the KH that Lee has put in the chat? Which system of transliteration do you use? There are many of them. Aharon links here to a great tool on the Open Siddur project where you can put Hebrew text in a box and then choose which transliteration scheme you want it to spit it out in. Some of them are really easy to read, some of them are really hard to read. Again, there's often a slider between accuracy and readability. If you want to translate something hyper accurately, if you look at transliterations that are used in academic papers on the Hebrew Bible, they use a system called the Society for Biblical Literature Transliteration Scheme. It is agonizing to read. It's got all sorts of weird symbols and underlines and big letters and small letters. It's very accurate, but it's actually very difficult for someone who's an English speaker to read in any fluid way. On the other hand, if you just write things the way they sound, that's a different way to transliterate. You're not rendering the words as they're written into Romanized Hebrew. You're actually transcribing the way we say Hebrew, and that could be very different than how it's written out. And Ruth and I have had many great debates about how to transliterate certain things based on whether it should represent the way we write the Hebrew or the way we say the Hebrew, which are not always the same. People also get very attached to certain transliterations, even though we have to acknowledge it is an arbitrary, often, representation of the Hebrew. For instance, if you spelled Shabbat with one B, people would lose their mind. But there's many other instances where there should be a double letter that we don't write it out, and no one cares. So we get kind of attached to certain ones. We see them, we think that's how you spell it. The amount of arguments people have every year about how you spell the word Hanukkah is indicative. Right? There is no right way to spell Hanukkah in English. You might have your own personal right way, but there is no objective right way because the way Hanukkah is spelled is Chet Nun Chaf Hey. That's the only way to spell Hanukkah. That's not necessarily something you can represent in any clear sense in English. Ruth?
Just going to say that most of the people on this call will agree with me that there's an English way of spelling Hanukkah, transliterating Hanukkah, and there's an American way of transliterating Hanukkah. I'll leave that there and carry on as you were. Thank you.
What Ruth has pointed out is that these things kind of become cultural, right? And also sometimes it's linguistic. So if anyone's looked at a Spanish or a Siddur published in a Spanish language context, you'll note that when they transliterate chet, they often use a J, which puts us off, right? Because we go, oh, what is that? But if you're a Spanish reader, often J is an aspirated H sound, jalapeno. So actually, if you're going to be a Spanish reader and you want to represent het, the closest way is a h sound from a aspirated J as a h. That's true of so many different languages. You have to use a transliteration system that matches the way in which people pronounce the words and the letters they're going to see. French ones will use OU often for different vowels that we would use O for or U for in English context. And there are perhaps differences that are customary in America versus Britain, often based on how British people or American people pronounce certain vowels. Same language, but obviously different vowel lengths and different vowel tones. Lots of great examples of this in terms of how we teach vowels in Hebrew. And often British people are just as guilty, by the way, of getting these things wrong. Just a reminder, because I harp on this all the time, there is no such thing as ivrit, just so everyone knows. There's no such thing as ivrit. There's only ivrit. That's not an American thing. That's just accuracy. Hebrew doesn't have a short I vowel. So you can only say ivrit. But how you write that, would you write that E-E-V-R-E-E-T? It would look ridiculous, but it would make you say it correctly, ivrit. But if you write I-V-R-I-T, you have to think, is that a short I vowel, ivrit, or is it a long I vowel, ivrit? It happens to be only the latter, but many people, because they only see it written that way, pronounce it ivrit, and they're wrong. Right. Instructions. Should there be instructions? What language do the instructions be in? How much is the scope of the instructions? Do the instructions tell you to sit down, stand up? Do they tell you what you're supposed to be doing now? Do they offer you insight into the meaning of what you're reading? Will the instructions incorporate art, diagrams, guidance about how to move or shape the words in a way that indicates what you're supposed to do? Lots of approaches you could have there. Commentary. Is there commentary? Who's writing the commentary? How much commentary is there? How is it put on the page? What's the scope of the commentary? That's not even getting into the art. Should there be art? How should the page be decorated? Which includes color and includes artistic elements of every page. A Siddur, which is just looks like a Microsoft Word document, is not going to be very nice to use. There are plenty of those out there. So usually there's some degree of design that goes into actually structuring the page. This is maybe less obvious to many people if you're not a publisher, but also how is the Siddur going to be shared? Is it something people can use and develop and take from? Can they use your translations? Or are you going to try and copyright something which is actually almost a universal asset? There's different approaches to this as well, including especially when there's artwork involved. And now AI translations and AI art, which also has its own challenges, which Aharon didn't address in this document. That's not even getting into page design, negative and white space. How much empty space is there? One of the things I know, Ruth, you didn't say it now, but you've complained, I've heard before about Lev Shalem, is there's all this stuff on the margins, and then where the text is, there's a huge amount of white space, right? It's like feels like they could have balanced that better, and I agree. Typography. Boy, do people get incensed about fonts. Not just Ruth and I, but lots of people get really charged up about fonts. There are right fonts and wrong fonts. There are fonts that communicate a certain thing about the kind of Hebrew and the kind of text. I have a Siddur published in Prague, which has the most beautiful Hebrew typography of any Hebrew book I've ever seen, in which they created a font specifically for the Siddur, which was based on the way in which Torah scrolls were written in Prague, with these huge, fat, thick letters and very skinny verticals. I love it. I wish I could use the font all the time, but they made it for that Siddur. It's proprietary. It's theirs. But part of the reason I like using that Siddur is because of the font, because I enjoy looking at it. And that matters, right? Similarly, typography can be useful. Does it distinguish between when something's a quote from the Torah versus when something's an instruction or an annotation? Are biblical verses highlighted in some way? Lena, you mentioned the line breaks before in Lev Shalem. How do we break up the lines so they're easy to read? Or is it just block of text that someone can scan all the way across? Annotations. We'll talk about annotations in Rina, Kol Rina. Musical notation. This is one you don't often see, but actually some Koran Siddurim do have in the back. Musical notation often for the Torah reading and sometimes for the Nusach for different ways of chanting the text. How big is the Siddur? We talked already about weight. Something is too heavy, too big is going to be awkward to hold. Something is too small, it's too difficult to read. Format, this is kind of a little bit nerdy when it comes to publishing, but how it's actually put together, hand stitching, glue binding, etc. And of course, are we printing in color, right? Not many Siddurim are printed in color, but I think it's, for me at least, a very important part of the experience, often, because color can communicate things that otherwise have to be spelled out with words. Accessibility is a big piece. We've already been asked by people about our Siddur whether we're going to make a large print version. Rightly so, because actually some people need a different size and shape of the Siddur. There's a question about how to make sure Siddurs are accessible in Braille. Are you using a font which is friendly to those who have dyslexia? Is the page tone that you're printing on actually good for high contrast for people who are having more trouble with their sight? All of those are things you need to think about when making a Siddur. This is just a list of questions, but they're all useful questions. Are there any questions that people might ask of making a Siddur that aren't on that list that they'd like to share before we have some examples?
Can I ask, one of the things that I find odd about transliterations is that do people get taught how to use a transliterated text? Because it's such a difficult thing to say this sort of mumbo jumbo. Because we learn to read English words, they have a shape and a pattern. That's how we read English by a sort of pattern recognition as an experienced reader. And yet these Hebrew words are, you're expected to say it quickly. But also I suppose the other thing is like my grandparents, they pronounced the prayers totally differently, to the way that we said it. They had the sort of very, well, some sort of, yeah, very Ashkenazi, Shobes and Shoibes, and is the transliteration that, or is it current, or is it Ivrit, or whose accent,
Yeah.
who's and with all those things, then you're asking someone that isn't probably experienced in reading Hebrew to say this stuff pretty quickly.
It's lots of great questions. I think you're absolutely right that many people assume those who speak and read Hebrew look at the transliteration and because they know what it's supposed to say, go, yeah, that's easy. It says Ika Dalvi Kadash Shemei Rabbah. But if you don't know that, it's probably much harder to puzzle out what these English letters, although they are English letters, actually are meant to sound like. And that's a challenge of transliteration. And it is a challenge. It's not easy. It's the reason it's the hardest thing we talk about is you're trying to write the sounds of Hebrew using English letters. You can do it, but it's never going to be exactly right, and it's always going to have a learning curve. And exactly as you say, Michelle, it's going to capture one particular pronunciation of that word. So you're right. You have to choose. You can't have options. You have to choose which way are we going to transliterate this. And it tells you a lot about the text. So if I open a Siddur and I look at that at a given text, and I see it says Yisgadal v'Yisgadash Shemei Rabbah, I immediately know something about that Siddur. I know it's published by probably an ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi publisher. I know it's probably going to include lots of different vowels because they're assuming someone's reading it in a heavy Ashkenazi style of Hebrew. And for me personally, I would then not use that Siddur because that would bug me. But someone else will go, oh, that's right, that's how it should be, and so that'll represent it to them. So there is a big challenge both in making transliteration readable and also making it reflective of real spoken Hebrew. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is why on the debates that Ruth and I have often about how transliteration should be done, I tend to err towards not seeing transliteration as a transcription of spoken language, but rather as looking at a written Hebrew word and exchanging the written Hebrew word for English letters that represent the same Hebrew letters. So, for instance, it's important to me when I transliterate things that every time there's a chet, we use the same letter in English to show it's a chet, whether that's CH or H with a dot or H with a bar or KH or whatever, that it's the same every time so that someone could work backwards and go, okay, that looks like this and now it makes sense to me. Other people feel differently and think it doesn't really matter as long as when you read it, you know what you're supposed to say. But it's really, really tricky. And I often hear people tell me that reading the transliteration is actually harder than reading the Hebrew, which I think has some merit because English phonetics are not easy, and Hebrew is actually very straightforward once you get accustomed to reading it, but it does take some practice. What's important is what you said first, which is that both require learning. If you're going to use the transliteration all the time, you still have to learn how to use the transliteration. Don't feel bad if you open it up and you go, this doesn't make any sense.
But
Because,
presumably the main purpose, the only one I can think of using transliteration is to enable you to participate in communal prayer. And so if you feel more comfortable reading English letters, then you will be using it alongside of listening to your congregation and the way they're praying it. So you'll learn as you go along.
yeah,
In some ways, I'm not sure a lot of these issues. The use of it is very personal,
yes.
I think.
And I think there's two ways to approach that personal use of it. Some people see it as an aid, as something that's helpful that can prop you up and help you to join with a community and help you understand Hebrew. And actually, it can even be a learning tool that you look at the transliteration and then look at the Hebrew and can work backwards to learn how to read Hebrew. Other people see it completely opposite as a crutch, that it prevents you from learning how to read the Hebrew because instead you're stuck on these English letters that don't make any sense. It tends to provoke very strong reactions. When we started this process for making Siddur Kol Rina 3 or 4 years ago, we met with every single Masorti community and asked them for their input. And the thing that people felt strongest about was transliteration. Some people said, I won't use it if there's any transliteration. Some people said, I won't use it if everything's not transliterated. And so we split the difference and made everyone unhappy. Um, just on our before we dive into Corina, and we're going to have a little look at some of the things we talked about in there before we have a more in-depth look in the weeks to come. Just want to share two other Siddurim so that we can look at some of these decision-making choices and how they came about. These are just ones I've made, so I'm not claiming they're good or necessarily insightful, but they might be useful choices. So the first is quite a weird one. So this is a Siddur that I made a few years ago, largely for my own purposes. It's only Hebrew, but with English instructions. The Hebrew is broken up into very short lines. The Hebrew is in a quite condensed font, meaning the letters are quite close together. I think many people have told me it's a little bit hard to read, but I like it that way. I made it for myself, so that's what matters. Unusually, it's a dark page background with white text and high contrast color. Again, that was the way I prefer it. It looks like dark mode on a screen or on a phone. And actually, it prints pretty well. If anyone wants to see, I have some floating around. You'll notice just a few things just to explain. I use color to highlight the important parts of the blessing. So here it's the latter part of the blessing. And throughout the course of the Siddur, the color is used in similar ways, particularly for the blessings to highlight the important part. As you go through, and I'm just going to skip ahead, I used a different color. So that's the evening service has yellow accents. The morning service, or is that yeah, that's the morning service, excuse me. The afternoon service has green accents, similar style, but with green. And the evening service, which is at the end, and this one has blue. All right, so similar style. Everything's quite uniform. Nothing's transliterated, nothing's translated, but there are English instructions throughout, and only Hebrew apparatus on top telling you where you are and what's happening. Again, I just made this for myself. I noticed a couple people have liked it and used it. Hopefully it's been handy. And it's worth saying, by the way, the text of this, if you noticed how brief this is, it's on less than 100 pages for the entire weekday Siddur, is because it's the text from Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, what he says you should say in terms of prayer, which is much shorter than what's in most published Siddurim today, but is the kind of minimum. It's the bare minimum that is halachically required. The project was to make a minimalist Siddur, and only have included what we must say. So that was this project. It's called Tfilat HaNesher. And you can see the vulture logo both on the page and on the background, which people will notice. It prints very faintly on the background, which I also kind of like. Any thoughts on this based on what we said, and how does it feel? How, does it seem like it would be useful? Is it usable? Is it alienating? Is it comforting? Before we look at another example.
I especially like the color coding of the different services. That's something that's like, I mean, this is obviously a very short Siddur. There's not many pages, but in a more dense Siddur with a lot more pages, being able to flick to a section would become much more efficient because you would see the color and know, I need to go back a bit further.
Yeah, it's a good point. And actually, a big shout out to Corin, who you'll hear me talk about a lot in these sessions. One of the things they do really well, I don't know if they do a Siddur with it, but they do a Tanakh that has the tabs, like an old encyclopedia, where it's cut out of the pages and it says what book it is. So you can quickly flip to that book. I love it for exactly that reason.
I really like this. I would have thought it all being Hebrew with no English to be a bit impenetrable, but I mean, I was given a Siddur at Cheder, which was all Hebrew, and it was just this mass of words, and it was horrible.
Yeah.
And a bit shocking, having been brought up with just the singer's prayer book, and that was the gold stamp of any Siddur. But this actually, the way that you've set it out, I really like the short lines. And
Yeah, it's funny.
It's accessible.
You mentioned earlier short lines. I wanted it to be thin. Actually, if I could, I can't do it because of the printer I use. I'd actually like the Siddur to be physically very thin. I don't know if you can see, but this is a little notebook, which is the shape I was trying to get this in. So it's actually a very narrow, small notebook. I couldn't get it. I was still working on it someday, but I actually want it to be thin and narrow and tuckable in a pocket. That was the idea. So, there's lots of extra width in this page. You can see you could cut the width of these pages by 30% and all the text would still fit. And that's why.
So ever the dissenting voice. I just find certainly that the first Emet V'Yatziv Nachon V'Kayam, I find that there's no flow. It's like two words to a line. I can't get into that. It's like it's disjointed to me. I can't flow. Yeah. I don't like the short lines. Not that short.
Love it.
I think there is a balance to be drawn, as we say.
There is a balance. Absolutely. And there's something to be said for personal preference, and there's also something to be said for the fact that, not everyone is going to connect with the same thing in the same ways. Okay, let's have a look at another. Again, I'm just using the examples I have on my computer, which are the ones I've made. This is some, oh wait, can you see that? Right. So these are pages from the Igal Sfaradi Siddur I made, which is my first experiment with this crazy business. It looks like this, if you can see in real version, Siddur Or Umasoret. And this is from Friday night. It's Shira Shirim. And just to point out a few things, this is not a typical page that we started with, but you can see the artwork that's incorporated. This is a bit of calligraphy that has the line Ani Ledodi Vedodi Li in Hebrew and Arabic combined together in a really interesting way. You can see the average page looks like this. This is Shira Shirim, which is included in the Sephardi Siddur. So everything is transliteration. Everything is transliterated. And to Michelle's point of how do you actually read this, we went really hard in this project on using accurate transliteration, but it makes it very hard to read. So you absolutely need a lesson or seven in how to read this transliteration if you're going to use it, because there are lots of diacritical marks, meaning accents, underlines, dots, that differentiate between things in Hebrew that are important that wouldn't necessarily be differentiated in the regular transliteration. It makes it difficult, I think, honestly, to read, but highly accurate. And the idea was just to say every Siddur is different and it needs to be for different purposes. The purpose for this was that there are people, particularly in Sephardi synagogues, particularly women, which is our intended audience, who maybe are very familiar with the text and would like to sing or speak along with it, but haven't learned Hebrew, haven't been taught how to read Hebrew. And so actually having a highly accurate transliteration might help in order to allow those people who want to be able to learn to say it out loud and to read it alongside. Every page has four columns. Transliteration is on the far right with some color always to distinguish it. English is in the middle right. Hebrew is in the middle left, and commentary on the far left. And that's true of every page. The commentary does have, as we said before, a dibor hamatchil, a word that connects it to what's being mentioned in the text. And you can see we use color to highlight the word that starts it and link you to the commentary on the left. So the color scheme here is unusual for many Jewish texts. It's red, it's green, it's blue, it's rich and colorful, and that was intended to be purposeful and to connect it to many Sephardi imagery. You'll also notice, just to zoom out on this page, this is the Kaddish, which may be familiar to you. This one's going to be slightly different because this is a Sephardi text. It's got two extra lines here that aren't in the Kaddish we say it sounds. V'yatzmach porkaneh v'karev meshicheh. And that's always how you immediately know if you're in a Sephardi synagogue. Hear someone say the Kaddish, and if they say those extra bits, then that's a good sign. You'll notice as well that there is a bar here on this page, this beige bar, which indicates that you need to stand during this time. This one, it's only mourners that stand, so we actually put the text that says mourners stand on it. On other pages, the bar to stand is there, but not as obvious. I'll find an example. Just one just says stand, right? And you can see here, this is Kabbalat Shabbat, Psalm 29, that the lines are broken up in the way that they're sung, similar to what we saw before. And you have long, narrow columns of text because it's a four-column layout. The result of the four-column layout is it's a lot of page flipping, right? I'll admit, as someone who's used the Siddur, because there's so little text on each page, because we're only using half the page, you have to flip a lot, right? The text is quite big, and it's all in one narrow column, and with the commentary and transliteration, you lose a lot of space. So it's not humongous, right? The weekday Siddur is 350 pages. The Shabbat Siddur is 800 pages. It's a bit hefty. But that's the sacrifice. Everything is a balance, as Ruth said. You do one thing to get it more accessible, to make it more detailed, you lose something else. There is no perfect combination. Any thoughts on this? What works, what doesn't, before we look at Corina a little bit?
So I've got this one, Adam, and I think it's a beautiful Siddur, but for actual use, it's too heavy. Like you really feel the weight of it, especially during the Amidah.
Yeah. The Shabbat one is chunky. Yeah. The weekday one's a little bit more digestible, and we did do a Friday night, which is paperback, which I actually really like because it's a lot easier to use. But yeah, I'm not psyched about how big this became. Now, the reason we had several people complain earlier about Bible paper, which is what's in some of the Reform Siddurim and the Lev Shalem that has very thin paper. It's called Bible paper because Bibles used to be printed on it. It's almost like vellum. The reason they use that is because there's a lot of pages, but they don't want it to be really heavy. So again, trade-off.
Yeah. I like the bar with the instructions.
Right.
Because it's subtle, but helpful.
That's the goal. There's a principle in design in general, not just book design, that you want to make things, you want to use universal design. So you want to do things in a way where the people who need it will notice and the people who won't will ignore it. The best example of this that is often cited are lowered curbs where you cross the street. Right? For those of us who are not wheelchair users or in any way disabled, we don't even notice that the curb goes down to street level where the zebra crossing is and then goes up a little bit on the other side. We just automatically cross it. We don't know walk here and not there. It doesn't matter to us. It's irrelevant. But for someone who's a wheelchair user, it's an absolute literal lifesaver to make sure that the curb is lowered at that spot. It's a good illustration of universal design. And trying to do that in a book is challenging to make things in a way where the people who need it will have it and the people who don't want it can ignore it.
Maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can put in orders for what the kind of Siddur we want, whether we want transliteration or not, whether we want commentary or not, so that if you prepared a Siddur that has, well, like these 4 columns, you could order how many columns you wanted
That'd be
and
cool.
what it should be.
Yeah.
You can do it with children's books that,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of interesting things to say about how you make sets of Siddurim or whether there's variations and whether they match. And, when we did a new version of this weekday, we had to try and figure out how we dealt with page numbers. Should they match the original or should they be different? Lots of interesting questions that come up. But let's look, because that's our goal, at the design of Siddur Kol Rina. We'll talk a little bit about the history of it. And then next week and the week after, going to get really deep into first Kabbalat Shabbat and Friday night. And then after that into Shabbat morning. So just a little bit of a history of the project. So Siddur Kol Rina started 4 years ago when Ruth and I pitched the Masorti movement on the idea that we should make our own Siddur. And they said, sure, that's a great idea. And we raised a bit of money and we started work on it then. And it's only now kind of come to fruition that we have a decent enough chunk that we can start doing something with it. So we've put together all of the Shabbat service from Kabbalat Shabbat on Friday night all the way until the end of Musaf on Shabbat afternoon. So we go from Yidi Nefesh to Adon Olam. That's what we have so far. We will make more of it, but that's what we have so far. The reason we made that is because it's enough to be useful and we want people to actually use it and give feedback. So we did, before we ever started, have a process of consultation, as I mentioned earlier, with every Masorti community, which they provided feedback, or rather pre-back, about what they wanted. I'd like this, I'd like that, like the other thing. As you might imagine, when we collated it, they were all completely different, but we did our best to try and get as many things as possible. The project was partially started, or rather dedicated as it began, in memory of Rena Wolfson, who some people may have known. That's Rena, who died on Yom Kippur 2021, and who was a educator in the Masorti movement, worked for the Masorti movement, and a member of New North London Synagogue, who was an extremely dedicated liturgy educator in particular. Rena ran a very popular course that some people may have done called Siddur Satnav, in which she taught people about the Siddur and how to use it. So it seemed a very appropriate thing to dedicate in her honor. And there are many wonderful verses that quote Rina, which of course is both her name and also one of the many words in Hebrew for song, one of which is included here, Kol Rina Vishua. People recognize this verse from Psalm 118, and we sing it during Hallel. So just a little bit about the history, and we've been really privileged to have the input and involvement of Paul Harris, Rena's widower, and also some of her children in the process of making this, and pleased to be able to dedicate it in her memory now that it's actually coming to fruition. Just a little bit here that we've highlighted, and I'm going to explain this, but there's a little kind of how to use this page. This is for the prototype, which is going to be distributed to our communities next few months. We explain a little bit about some of the things you're going to see on the page here. And we have a form that we want people to actually use the Siddur, and then after Shabbat, fill in what they liked, what they didn't like, how they found it, a lot of the same things we discussed today. So let's look at a page. Right. First impressions, this is Yidi Nefesh. What do you see in this that's based on what we've talked about? Good, bad, similar, different, and then we'll explain about what you see.
It's very small.
I love it. Sorry.
So was that you, Andrea, that said you love it?
No, it seems to be very small print.
Okay, very good. So it is, keep in mind you're looking at a spread, so there's a margin in the middle. And depending on the actual print, it prints out on A5 size is how we've done it. So on the page, it's actually not too bad. It takes up most of it. There's just a big margin in the center for the printing. But there is a lot of negative space. I think that's worth saying. Right, there's a lot of negative space, which is intentional. What else do we notice?
Sid?
Really great translation.
Right, so they have to
I
translate.
get it. I get this translation. I
Great.
can't often say that when I look at a Siddur, but I really like it.
Pleased to hear it. The goal of the translation was to make it both fairly accurate and also fairly readable, to really strike the middle ground of that line. Sometimes it's more one or the other, but actually Yedi Nefesh is a good example where people almost never translate it literally. But actually, this is a far more literal translation than most.
I also like the large font at the beginning of each paragraph of the English. So, because I might not read the whole translation, but if one of the words catches my eye, I'll read that paragraph. I like that.
Lovely.
I have a comment about that. So
Yeah.
why did you do it a much bigger font in English for like soulmate and beautiful, etc. And in Hebrew you left it the same?
Yeah, it's a good question. I had the same thought when I looked at this: is why don't we make the Yud Hey Vav Hey big? And maybe we should, because of course that's the point of the Yedi Nefesh prayer, is that each of the paragraphs starts with one of the letters of God's name, Yud Hey Vav Hey. So probably it's worth emphasizing that so people can see the acrostic, as you say, Joel. You notice, sorry? You notice the transliteration here is for the whole thing, but it's quite small. It's in quite a small print, and it's fairly unobtrusive. That was the goal. We'll see on other pages that there's even less of it. But because Yedid Nefesh is sung in its entirety, we wanted to include the full transliteration. We tried to use a transliteration system that was pretty easy to read, while also being fairly accurate and fairly consistent. And without too many fancy, there's no diacritical marks, right? There's only an apostrophe to show where a shava is, and there's a hyphen when there's two vowels next to each other to make it easier to pronounce, exact like ta'am or no'am. Right, and every time there's an apostrophe, it's a shava that's pronounced. Mishoch, yedidutach, kemo, etc. So you can see the separation of the syllables. Okay. You might notice in the Hebrew there's some funny things going on. So we did a lot of work, which I'm particularly proud of, to indicate, and Mike, I know you'll appreciate this, when there is what's called a kamatz katan, which is a kamatz, which is pronounced as an O instead of an A. You can see one here. Vechoneni. We put a little O, a little circle above it. And we also wanted to indicate when a shava is pronounced because it's really hard to tell if you don't know the rules of grammar. So here you can see venis micha. That's telling you with that little caret, this is pronounced. Right?
Excellent.
Some of them are more obvious than others. This is a one that's often mispronounced. So a lot of people will see this say mikvodach, but it's actually mikvodach. There's an extra syllable there. And that little caret helps you to see that. You can see it's quite small. When you zoom in, you can see it clearly. So if you don't care about the shvana, I don't know who wouldn't care, but if you don't care about the shvana, it doesn't bother you. But if you're one of the people like Mike and I who are reading it going, I want to make sure I get this right, you'll notice it. That's the idea.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I don't know. It's a question of not being able to please all the people all the time. But I kind of feel badly that the English translation and the Hebrew aren't aligned. And then, so that if I were looking for a translation of a particular phrase, yeah, I mean, it's okay. It's only 4 verses on this line, but it's a bit hard because they're not, what do you call it, parallel to each other.
You know, it's a really good point. We chose to not try and line up every line, which also means sometimes they're not the same size either. And that's because they have different things on each side of the page that are going to affect that, right? So here, there's quite a lot of transliteration. And if we match the lines, we'd have to have a lot of empty space on the English page because it would only go up to this point across the page and then it'd be empty. And that also is the other factor is the commentary, right? So we included throughout the Siddur commentary, which is drawn from Rabbi Louis Jacobs' archive of writings. So we combed through all of Louis Jacobs' books and pulled out interesting bits and pieces that pertain to what we had on the page, and as a result, have commentary here and there from Rabbi Jacobs. Sometimes that's longer, sometimes that's shorter, just like the translation is sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. So it doesn't always scan directly across the page. Yeah.
I I find it a bit of a shame that the Hebrew is so small. I mean, obviously this is on the so you can't really tell, but definitely much smaller than the English.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a shame because I mean maybe you do need to kind of emphasize those first words, because the English looks like a poem,
Mm-hmm.
and the Hebrew just looks like I don't know,
Interesting.
just
Yeah,
a
no,
block of writing.
I think that's true. I think it's interesting to compare the two of them, and actually, you only really see that when you have it in front of you like this, right? To see the difference. Working on it online, you're usually working on one page at a time. Seeing them next to each other changes it. So I think you're right. One thing that's tricky is, we can only make the text so big or so small before it kind of runs out of space. And so you have to kind of find the balance. I think what might be better to do on this page is make the English a bit smaller and either have a little bit more commentary or just have a little bit more empty space so that they don't look quite so different. But it depends. Let's look at just quickly the next page. You see a difference, and then we're going to save the rest of Kabbalat Shabbat for the next time we meet next week. Any different feelings about this and anything we see differently, things that we can point out?
I have noticed before and now about your justification. So because your English justification isn't echoing the Hebrew justification.
Yeah.
And is that I wouldn't know how to then again how to flick between the two.
Yeah, it's very fair. So the challenge here, and those who have translated Hebrew will know, is that usually when you translate a single Hebrew sentence into English, the English sentence is 3 to 4 times longer than the Hebrew sentence. So doing any project where you have Hebrew English side by side is always a challenge to balance because they just don't ever seem to fit, right? To make the English as terse as the Hebrew would make it totally unreadable. So you end up adding a lot of words to make the English readable. And that means what we've done here is where there's a Hebrew line that isn't broken, that goes straight across, but in English we have too much to fit on a line. We've indented the second part of it so that you can see it's one line. And then when it goes back to full justification, that's when you're in the next line in the Hebrew. So take the first example here, in whose hand are the earth's depths and the horned mountain peaks. In Hebrew, that's all one pretty short line of 7 words. Asher biado mechkere aretz v'toafot harim lo. Right, so literally that second phrase, which has 3 words, in English is 5. And the first phrase, which has 4 words, in English ends up being 7. So every time you have more English than you do have Hebrew, and that's part of the reason we've done that, is so you can see where the verses break, even though we can't fit it. It'd be so tiny to try and fit the English in the same way. They're just such different languages, you had to make an adjustment.
Do you mind me just saying that
Yeah.
then would it not, just in the way that you've got come as a landmark,
Yeah.
if there was another landmark through the Hebrew that then corresponded with an English landmark, so you could say Kihu Eloheinu, for instance, in bold.
I think on different, just sorry, Michelle, on different pages it varies quite a lot throughout. So on different pages it is. I don't know if you're, I don't know, if you're going through this and if you're reading it or if you're praying this or if you're following, I don't know how much you do actually flip across between the translation or if you're just following the Hebrew because that's what we're
This
doing
is
at the time.
exactly the sort of thing that we want to have people do, is because you don't think about a Siddur, and to go back to where we started, and we should wrap up fairly soon for today, but you have the experience in using a Siddur of not just reading a book, but actually praying with something, and that means it's a little bit different. And you don't really know how you're going to feel about it until you use it. And so I think a lot of people will probably come back to us and say, oh, this doesn't work or this works, or why don't you try this? And we'll probably have to change a lot of things. That's why we're being very relaxed about the schedule for getting from here to a full published version. And every page is different. I mean, these Psalms, right? This one, we have a huge highlighted in English and not in Hebrew, right? Maybe we should do. Why didn't we? Probably to make sure it fit better. And sometimes because I don't know that it needs to match the same. Here, the indents are much smaller, right? Because it seemed to work better. Not always a consistency with how we approach the English and how we deal with the representation of the Hebrew. One thing you'll notice, which we didn't point out, but worth saying, is we included something I'm very pleased about, which is these little sources. So whenever there's a biblical verse cited, which of course here is the whole psalm, but elsewhere is only a few, we've tried to emphasize. I'll just scoot down so we can see an example. So here in the Amidah, right, in the Kedusha, this is from Isaiah, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And you might not know that, but here we wanted to say this is from Isaiah. And you can see a much more complicated page as well, with other marks that are meant to indicate. You see the little arrows tell us when to go up on our toes. We did something similar for when you bow. If you look here, we've got a little symbol for when you need to bow at the beginning of the Amidah, and similarly at the end of that first bracha. And you can see again, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. The source for that is Exodus 3:15. It's a little bit misaligned. Those are also things we're going to be fixing as we go about. Over the course of working on it for a long time, things get moved. One thing more to point out, and then we do have to stop, and we'll come back to this next week and look more in detail and talk more about the content of the Siddur, is on both sides of the page. This blue bar, if you notice it here in the Amidah, is on any page next to text where you're supposed to stand for.
Oh, that's good.
Never have to include an instruction that's to stand up or sit down. You can just scroll through and see, oh, if there's a blue bar there, I'm supposed to be standing. And when the blue bar goes away, then that means you can sit down. So at the end of the Amidah, after well, this is Hallel. So assuming you're doing Hallel, you have all that. Eventually it goes away, I promise. So here you can see. Taking out the Torah, Ein Kamocha, you don't have to stand up. When we get to Vayhi bin Soa, you rise. And so we have the blue bar there.
Get that, Lee?
We're gonna have a chance to look more in depth at many of these things, and perhaps also talk a little bit more about the translation choices, and the transliteration choices and the commentaries. All of I think are really good. But hopefully today's been a good introduction to how we got to even making a Siddur and why the design of a Siddur matters. What I encourage you to do is to look at Siddurim that you use and think about them a bit differently as a designed product. Why did they make the choice they did? Why is this there and not there? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Too often we're just handed a book when we get into shul and we go, okay, I guess this is it. But actually choosing a Siddur that reflects your own prayer practice can be a very powerful thing. And whether you're like me and have 20, 30 of them and use a different one every time, or whether you find one that you're obsessed with and use it every day, there's something very powerful about the relationship one has with the Siddur as a book which contains the prayers, even though they're all mostly the same. The diversity about how they're created and what they look like and what they feel like is really important for an active practice of prayer. So next week, we'll dive more into Friday night, where Friday night services come from, Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv, and we'll use the example of Kol Rina and talk about some interesting features of it. And then on our last session, we'll talk more about Shabbat morning and how that's structured and why we do the things we do and what you have to do and what you don't have to do and what's included and why. So thanks for joining us this evening as we start our tour of the Siddur, and hopefully you don't look at a Siddur the same way. And if you have any questions or you notice anything weird, please do post it in our WhatsApp group or things that you notice that you think are interesting. Your own Siddur features always good to see and to reflect on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great
Very
session.
interesting.